everyone, welcome to Jerematics Tutoring. In this video, I will be teaching you about reference angles. But before I teach you about reference angles, I need to show you how to draw negative angles, something I didn't show you in the last video. So, if you draw a negative angle, the direction of rotation is the opposite of what it would be if it was positive. Because remember, in standard position, if your angle is positive, then the direction of rotation is counterclockwise. But if your angle is negative, then the direction of rotation is clockwise. So if your angle is positive, remember the direction of rotation is like this. And if your angle is negative, it goes like this, the opposite direction, clockwise. So if it's negative, it's clockwise. If it's positive, it's counterclockwise. What does that mean in terms of our quadrants? Does that change where our angle would lie? It sure does. Because look, so here's our 0 degrees. 0 degrees is here, it's at the same place. Negative 90 is here. Negative 180 is right here. Negative 270 is right here. So as you can see, it's pretty much the opposite, right? Because rather than going clockwise, counterclockwise, you're going clockwise, right? It's the opposite direction. So if I ask you to draw the angle, let's say negative 60 degrees. How do we draw that? Well, remember in the last video I was showing you, if you have an angle of 45 degrees, then you would separate your quadrant in half. And if you would have an angle that's like a multiple of 30, then you would simply divide your quadrant diagonally into 3 equal parts, like this. There's 3 parts. See? 1, 2, 3. So our negative 60 would lie right here. Since negative 60 degrees is 2/3 of negative 90. So this would be negative 60. And as you can see, the initial arm always stays on the x-axis, and even when your angle is negative, it still lies on pretty much the positive side of the x-axis. And then this would be negative 60 degrees. So as you can see, it's pretty much the same idea, except it's just the opposite direction. I'll show you another one. I'll show you negative 210. Negative 210 degrees. Well, which quadrant would that lie in? Is it bigger than negative 90? No, it's smaller, because the larger the negative number is, the smaller it is, right? Really, it's a bigger negative number, but it's smaller in terms of the actual number itself, right? Since it's negative. Negative 90, negative 180. No, negative 210 is smaller than that. Negative 180, negative 270. Yes, it's in this quadrant. How do we draw negative 210? Well, remember, if it's a multiple of 30, then you can divide your quadrant into 3 equal parts. So we divide this quadrant into 3 equal parts. So negative 180, negative 210, negative 240, negative 270. Well, where does our negative 210 lie? Our negative 210 lies right here. And then now we draw an arrow showing the direction of rotation, and since it's negative, the direction is clockwise. So that's negative 210 in standard position. Now I will be talking to you about reference angles. A reference angle is simply the closest angle to the x-axis. So for example, if we draw an angle of 135 degrees, 135 degrees is in our reference angle. 135 degrees is the angle that we use in our calculation of the reference angle. It's the closest angle to the x-axis, and remember, the x-axis is the horizontal one right here. So that would mean is, how far is 135 from 180? How do you calculate that? Well, to calculate that, you simply do 180 degrees minus your angle that lies in this quadrant. So that's 180 minus 135, which is equal to 45 degrees. So that would give you 45 degrees. So that would mean the reference angle of 135 degrees is 45 degrees. Because it's all about getting from your angle to the x-axis. Because the reference angle is the nearest angle to the x-axis. 45 degrees. And of course, it all depends on which quadrant your angle lies in, the way you're going to calculate the reference angle. So to explain this, if your angle is in quadrant 1, the angle you draw in quadrant 1 is always your reference angle, because it's always the same distance from the x-axis. Because if you draw 30, well, it's 30 degrees away from the x-axis. 45, it's 45 degrees away from the x-axis. 60, 60 degrees away from the x-axis. That's just quadrant 1. Then quadrant 2 right here, you subtract your angle from 180. And then if it's in this quadrant, well, since your angle is bigger than 180, then you subtract 180 from your angle, because your angle is bigger, or else you get a negative number, and your reference angle cannot be negative, it's positive. And then if it's over here, then if it's in quadrant 4, then you would simply do 360 minus your angle, and that would give you the reference angle in quadrant 4. That's how I'll calculate reference angles, and I'll give you a few examples, just so you get pretty comfortable calculating reference angles. So now, first one, 30 degrees, right here, 30 degrees, 30 degrees. 30 degrees, what's the reference angle, 30 degrees? Well, how far is 30 degrees away from the x-axis? It's 30 degrees. So the angle, the reference angle is 30 degrees. If we got 150, if we got 150 degrees, well, how do we draw 150 degrees? Well, remember, since it's a multiple of 30, we can divide our quadrant into 3 equal parts. This would be 90, 120, 150, 180. So 150 is right here. Angle of 150. What's 180 minus 150? That's 30. So our reference angle is 30 degrees. Well, what about if it lies in this quadrant? Like I've said earlier, your angle would be bigger than 180. So we simply subtract the big angle that we drew, and we subtract 180 from it. So for example, we've got, let's say we got 225. Say we got 225, which is perfectly in the center of quadrant 3. 225. We do 225 minus 180. What's 225 minus 180? That's 45. So our reference angle is 45 degrees. And as you can see, it's always the angle that your terminal arm forms with the x-axis. That's really another way to look at it, because that's really what it is. It's a terminal arm that decides your reference angle, because it all depends on where the terminal arm is, which is this little line over here. And then now for my last example of the video, it's this quadrant right here. The example I will be giving you will be, let's go with 330. And 330 is a multiple of 30. So we can actually separate our quadrant into 3 equal parts. And here we got 270, 300, 330, 360. So 330 lies right here. And since the angle is positive, the direction is counterclockwise. And then we got 330, we got 360. Now we do 360 minus 330. And this gives us a reference angle of 30 degrees. So reference angle is 30 degrees, and normally use the letter A to represent a reference angle. That's the letter we like to use to represent a reference angle. Well, you see, so the reference angle is 30 degrees. So that's how you calculate reference angles. So does anybody have any questions?
Yes. If the angle is negative, will the reference angle be negative?
No. Reference angle is always positive regardless of whether your angle is negative or not, because a reference angle is simply the closest angle to your x-axis. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Angelique, because of your question, I'm actually going to give an example involving a negative angle we draw and then how to determine the reference angle. The example I will be giving you will be theta is equal to negative 120 degrees. Negative 120 degrees. How do we draw that? Well, because if the angle is negative, the direction of rotation is clockwise. So we move this way. And where does negative 120 lie? Is negative 120 between negative 90 and negative 80? It sure is. And like in all the other examples I gave, if your angle is a multiple of 30, you can divide your quadrant into 3 parts. And the same trick still applies to negative numbers, because it's still a multiple of 30 regardless. So we've got negative 90, negative 120, negative 150, negative 180. Well, where does negative 120 lie? Negative 20 lies right over here. Negative 20. And now we draw an arrow showing that the direction is clockwise to show that this is indeed a negative angle. Now we must figure out the reference angle. How do we do that? Well, like I've mentioned earlier on in this video, your reference angle will always be positive regardless. So basically what we do is, I just like to do the opposite. I like to do 180 minus 120. And just simply disregard the negatives. And then decide which angle's bigger. And then after that, subtract from there. So for example, we got negative 180. We can look at it as just 180, because 180 is bigger than 120. And then we got negative 120. Well, we just take out the negative, because a reference angle is always positive, because it's always the angle that it forms with the x-axis. And the angle is always positive regardless the reference angle. And you just take out the negatives, see which one's bigger, and then you subtract the smaller one from the bigger one, so you always get a positive number. 180 degrees minus 120 degrees is equal to 60 degrees. And as you can see, it forms an angle of 60 degrees with the x-axis. That's how you would determine a reference angle when you draw a negative angle in standard position. Well, thank you for watching this video, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I will respond to them. And if you like my content and would like to stay up to date, then feel free to subscribe.